Hello, I'm Julian Sanchez, and this is your WatchCats weekly news roundup for Friday, July 11th, 2025. Here once again after our 4th of July break with Noah Kunin.
Hey, everybody.
Lead story today. Earlier this week, the Supreme Court essentially vacated a hold that lower courts had placed on plans to radically downsize the federal workforce. There had been a stay essentially put on mass layoffs on the grounds that when Congress creates a certain federal structure, creates federal agencies, that while the executive branch can hire and fire within kind of normal bounds, exercising control over those agencies, the lower courts had held, or at least had paused it while the question was litigated, whether the president can effectively destroy an agency in all but name by hollowing it out so severely on his own authority, or whether that's the kind of thing that look, if you're effectively all but eliminating a federal agency that Congress created, you need the participation of Congress to do something that dramatic. And so a stay had been ordered pending litigation of some of those questions. In an 8-1 and very brief ruling, the Supreme Court essentially vacated that stay. Didn't really actually rule on the underlying merits of the question. It's an incredibly short, unsigned opinion, but essentially said, look, at this stage, all we're dealing with is the initial executive order. The lower courts need to do a kind of more agency-specific and fact-specific analysis. As we've seen in a lot of similar recent cases, Ketanji Brown Jackson was the lone voice in dissent with a long and sort of stinging rebuke to the court for, in essence, creating a situation where, whatever kind of happens going forward, it's going to be kind of impossible to get the toothpaste back in the tube. That is to say, just noting, hey, the lower courts are the ones with the expertise and the ability to conduct a kind of an intensive factual review. The Supreme Court needs to stop constantly swooping in, often with very limited briefings, second guessing the judgment of those lower courts that have had the more extensive briefings, that have more information, are able to do more in-depth factual analysis. And in this case in particular, the reality is, if the courts do later decide, oh, actually, what they're doing is unlawful, you can't really easily undo that. If you fire, most of the staff of an agency, those people will go find other work. You will lose institutional expertise. You can't just say, oopsie, hit rewind. So Ketanji Brown Jackson was the lone dissenting voice there. That said, it kind of remains to be seen what the lower courts are going to do with this as it gets kicked back to them. So that is a story that will continue to unfold. Noah, what do you have for us?
Well, another team that is not currently being removed from the government, despite a general souring of their relationship with the chief executive, with Trump, is what our friends at Wire are calling DOGE 2.0, essentially referring to the fact that even without Elon Musk and some of the other individuals who were supposedly leading and coordinating DOGE technologists are still cycling in and out of federal agencies, usually still in that sort of lonely sort of detailing program. Very few of them are actually getting converted to full-time employees. And even those that are, it's not clear to me if they're being converted into permanent federal civil servants that have an increasingly shrinking number of rights, or temp civil servants who are still full-time, but you essentially could go through a process to remove them. And there are 2-year terms where you in fact have to switch jobs or term out of the federal government entirely. According to the reporting, they're still detecting evidence that these individuals are building products, are cutting contracts before cycling out of those agencies again. Given that software development is all about doing like flashy big launches of important software. That's what these people's bread and butter is. It's what's important to their careers. It's what's important for these federal agencies, for these new tools, these new systems to get used. So the fact that we're not actually seeing not just no flashy launches, but no launches at all, it sort of brings into question what this reporting is referring to. It might be that their exaggeration of what a product is might just be like a little data analysis tool. Or it might be that the products or systems that Doge staff are building are out of sight, not just of the public who might be using these services, but actually out of the sight of the internal teams in these agencies, which seem pretty prone to leak it on a fairly quick basis to the press. So it just raises the question, is this sort of like Doge 2.0, huffing its own copium and trying to talk up its own work, even though not a lot of substantive change is in fact happening, because we've been sort of cut off from any sort of public GitHub access where the code might be posted? Or are they intentionally building a lot of stuff, but building it in complete secret for some use down the road? We'll have to continue to track that.
I mean, we'll talk about this in a second in a couple other stories that are sort of on this theme. But I know one of them kind of noted, actually, internally, they're telling us, don't even really call it Doge anymore. Talk about the USDS. That was the former US Digital Service, now the US Doge Service. I wonder if part of what's going on here is after the fallout with Musk, I mean, two things. One is a lot of what Doge did got a lot of attention, and polling suggested was sort of unpopular. At least a lot of specific things they were doing were viewed as reckless. Musk himself and polled badly, and so two things might be happening here. One is a shift away from the Doge brand, which maybe they regard as damaged, as opposed to a shift away from just the actual activity, but also a desire not to credit an entity that is so strongly associated with Musk. Now that, to the extent that they have things that they might otherwise want to boast about, it may just be that the White House now doesn't want anything good that they would otherwise crow about to be associated with something that people still think of as Elon Musk's agency. But that is speculation on my part. I will say, in this vein, we have a couple of stories, one from the Wall Street Journal and one from Politico. In the Wall Street Journal, a story on the fight between Musk acolytes and the White House for control of Doge. The Journal here reports that there is a band of Musk loyalists who are fighting to preserve the power of Doge and influence over it after Musk's departure. And one of the things they talk about is longtime Musk associate and loyalist Steve Davis, who, while he's sort of formally left the government, there's some disagreement between the sources about how much influence he continues to wield, but is apparently still in regular contact with the Doge team that remains, and is viewed as, in a sense, a kind of an extension of Musk that continues to sort of steer things to some extent, even though he's no longer formally has a role within Doge. And then in Politico, a story about core Doge staffers leaving government service. So we've talked about a lot of folks who were part of Doge getting effectively seconded out and becoming part of other government agencies and sometimes taking on permanent roles there. But Politico notes that at least 8 of the original core Doge staffers have now left the government. And in both stories, we get a sense that, as I think we kind of predicted might be the case when Musk and Trump fell out, it seems like the folks at Doge are getting kind of grilled in the way that they used to grill staffers at the agencies where they were embedded, right? They were notoriously asking staff at various agencies, how loyal to Donald Trump are you? Now it's the Doge people who are kind of under scrutiny for whether they're really part of the, Trump agenda, or whether their primary loyalty is to Elon Musk, since so many of them, came from his inner circle and from companies linked to him.
Yeah, and if there's an appropriate time, because we know how Trump hates admitting failure. In fact, I don't think has ever or will ever admit to it. And so dissolving Doge right now, even despite its association with Musk, would also be considered a failure of himself. There's a convenient off-ramp for that, because going all the way back to the original Doge executive order, the Doge temporary organization, which is in parallel to USDS, right? The Doge temporary organization self-destructs next year, July 4th, 2026. Now, even though that's the temporary organization, and some of the staff of Doge may have converted out of a temp status by then, that would be a convenient time to also brush under the rug anyone or any project that Trump or his team feels like is either not performing or so permanently stained by the Musk-Trump fallout that they can no longer work with him. So we'll continue to watch out for that date. Meanwhile, we are even now still getting evidence about what has happened over the past several months in terms of what systems and what data Doge has gotten access to. They got access, according to logs seen by NPR, to the national payment system at the Farm Service Agency, which is part of USDA. The Farm Service Agency, or FSA, basically is the main organization that gets American farmers and ranchers afloat in times of disaster relief, conservation grants, or just like straight up business loans to continue to function. Interesting enough, the individual who got access to this underlying and sensitive data system is Jordan Wick, who is the same individual at the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, instituted that briefly public repository of code, next-gen backdoor, to slurp up all the data of all the cases the NLRB and their private sort of adjudications or commentary on them to some other data system of unknown provenance. I know Congress was poking them about this. As far as I can see, we still have answers as to if that data was in fact exfiltrated. We don't know if the application actually was ever run, just that it was coded. And if it did run, where did the data go? On what systems is it now? Back over at the Washington Post, they've started to try to map out how a comment that we've brought up several times is that many of the agencies Doge infiltrated have lots of places where data could be useful to Musk operations, right? Whether that's XAI, the sort of ARM part of X, formerly Twitter, where things like Grok is made, or Tesla, or SpaceX. And so they have a great visualization of what data that would be useful for, not just for their own operations, but where they might have been able to see records that contain their competitors' trade secrets. This is a huge thing in government. Obviously, keeping the government's data safe is really important. And as federal staff, we went through a very large regime to make sure that our operational security on that was solid. But I would say at a ratio of 10 to 1, in terms of for every one inherently government secret I had access to, I had access to 10 more business secrets, right? In order for the government to just do its job as it relates to not individuals, not its own sensitive information, but private information, from like something mundane as pricing information to like actual like trade secret or like super internal IP stuff. It was more of that kind of thing. So, for example, at GSA, we ran a federal cybersecurity program that certified certain cloud systems like Amazon Web Services or Google Compute or Microsoft Azure as safe. Well, obviously, in order to do that, you need to understand, you need to be able to see how they work at a really fundamental and specific level. That is worth more than its weight in gold, even though it doesn't weigh anything, it's binary information, to its competitors, right? So it's incredibly important, right, that you're not acting with either improper care or incompetence with that data because of how it could leak in any way, shape, or form to their competitors, right? And this is why I have zero faith that Doge has acted or will continue to act in any sort of proper way regarding that non-public information.
And one of a particular point of concern there is this seems something that would, unless you were very dumb about it, be hard to decisively prove after the fact. That is to say, Musk or his companies were to get an advantage because you have staff with access to this sort of privileged information about competitors or that otherwise of benefit to those companies, and that's shared in some kind of outside channel. It might actually be very difficult if suddenly these companies are now acting on this information and outflanking competitors or otherwise gaining an unfair advantage. As a result of that, is it because they had inappropriate access, or were they just very good at predicting what their competitors were going to do. It's unless you actually get the smoking gun, it's one of those things that you can just suspect, but it becomes very hard to prove decisively. So that is certainly a concern. We also, our former guest, Nathan Tankus of Notes on the Crises, speaking of access to data systems, has a very long piece on what the headline calls DOGE's dangerously hasty IRS modernization plan. This is something we've spoken out about in previous roundups. Wired has been really killing it with coverage of the attempts to modernize IRS on a time frame that most people who have been involved in major IT system overhauls find unrealistic, bordering on reckless. And so this is a pretty good deep dive, not just into what DOGE is planning to do. They know there's not actually a great deal of transparency there. So the public knows a lot less than you might like about exactly what it is they're planning to do, but also looking at the sort of history of IRS modernization. This is noting that this is something that the agency has been undertaking for years now, trying to upgrade outdated legacy systems and shift software systems to more modern programming languages. A lot of stuff is still running on COBOL, which was a popular programming language back in the 60s, but this is not the kind of thing you really learn. You go to learn programming in the 21st century. And so acknowledging this is something that is a good idea to do, but that the speed with which DOGE appears to be attempting to kind of speed run an upgrade is obviously risky, because normally this is something that takes years. Indeed, it is an ongoing process that has taken years, but also just is out of line with the way agencies normally do these things. I mean, I suppose you might say, well, it takes so damn long, maybe that's not bad, but certainly should raise an eyebrow, say, hey, there is a way agencies normally undertake modernization because of these huge downside risks. If you break something in a system as kind of central to government functioning as the IRS, and something that, will also, of course, affect individual taxpayers by the billions if there are problems with their ability to file their taxes, or the records that are tracking, what money they owe and what money they're owed. So a good long piece there that really makes use of a lot of in the weeds sort of institutional knowledge about IRS and about government modernization programs more broadly.
Jumping over to The Independent, rounding up news reporting from a couple different sources. Donald Trump giving an ultimatum this week to Republican senators who are on the fence regarding the DOGE sort of clawback bill, a rescissions bill. And one of the drastic cuts that are in there is clawing back, I think, about $1.1 billion from both NPR and PBS. We've had some Republican senators, some usual suspects, some less usual, indicating that they will not support these cuts. And Trump saying that if they don't support the cuts, he will not endorse any of their re-election efforts. NPR and PBS have filed lawsuits attempting to block this, along with its support of executive orders, basically objecting to it on constitutional grounds with the First Amendment, saying like, hey, this is not for cause, right? This is because we have taken a First Amendment right in articulating our speech, and we are being punished for it.
Well, that's our news roundup for Friday, July 11th. Hope you will join us for our next future full Watchcats podcast episode proper, and yet another news roundup next week. I've been Julian Sanchez.
And I'm Noah Cunin.
See you next time.